Tonight, we're going to step carefully behind the heavy oak doors of medieval castle life, where power was negotiated not just in throne rooms and battlefields, but in the most private chambers where kings and queens lived their most human moments. This isn't the sanitized version of history you learned in school. This is the raw, complicated, often shocking reality of what it meant to wear a crown when your body belonged as much to the state as it did to yourself. Picture yourself standing in a great stone corridor, torchlight flickering against tapestried walls. The air is thick with beeswax, old timber, and the weight of centuries. You can hear the distant sounds of the court, laughter, arguments, the scrape of chairs on stone. But what we're exploring tonight exists beyond those public spaces, in the chambers where medieval rulers faced their most private battles and their most public expectations. The oil lamp beside you casts dancing shadows as we begin this journey into the intimate world of medieval monarchy, where love, politics, power, and human frailty created a web so complex it determined the fate of kingdoms. The medieval king was never just a man. He was a living embodiment of his realm, a walking symbol whose every breath carried political weight. His body wasn't his own property. It belonged to the state, to the church, to the future of his dynasty. When we think about medieval monarchy, we imagine ceremonial grandeur, the weight of the crown, the authority of the scepter. But the heaviest burden a king carried wasn't made of gold and jewels. It was biological. The principle of primogeniture, where the eldest legitimate son inherited the throne, was the cornerstone that held medieval society together. Without a clear male heir, kingdoms could fracture into civil war. Foreign powers could claim succession rights, and entire dynasties could crumble overnight. The king's virility wasn't a private matter. It was a national security issue. Every morning, when the king woke, courtiers and nobles held their breath, hoping for news that might secure the realm's future. Every time he entered his bedchamber with the queen, it wasn't just an intimate moment between husband and wife. It was a strategic act whose success or failure could determine whether the kingdom would know peace or descend into chaos. The pressure was extraordinary. Imagine conducting your most private life under the microscope of an entire court, knowing that your performance in the bedchamber would be analyzed, whispered about, and recorded by chroniclers. The king's masculinity became a political performance, where failure to produce an heir could be interpreted as divine displeasure or personal weakness. This relentless focus on succession created a strange paradox at the heart of medieval monarchy. The most powerful man in the kingdom was also, in many ways, the most vulnerable. His authority depended on his ability to perform one of the most basic human functions. Yet that function was complicated by politics, religion, and the constant scrutiny of those around him. The royal bedchamber itself was more than furniture. It was a sacred space, blessed by priests, designed by architects who understood its symbolic importance. The bed where the king and queen lay wasn't just where they slept. It was where the future of the realm was conceived. Court physicians would bless it with rituals meant to ensure fertility. The very linens were chosen for their symbolic properties: white for purity, red for vitality, gold for divine favor. Medieval medical theory, dominated by the ancient Greek concept of the four humors, placed enormous emphasis on achieving the perfect balance for conception. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile had to align properly in both the king and queen for successful reproduction. Court physicians would prescribe specific diets, times of day for intimacy, even particular positions they believed would favor the conception of a male child. This wasn't just folk wisdom. This was considered the height of medieval science. Physicians treated conception like an alchemical process, where precise conditions had to be met for the desired transformation to occur. The king might be told to eat warming foods like spices and red meat to heat his humors, while the queen would be given cooling foods like fish and greens to balance hers. The humoral theory also held that both men and women produced seed necessary for conception, making the queen's satisfaction crucial for successful reproduction. This placed additional pressure on the king, who had to ensure not just his own performance, but his wife's response. Medieval medical texts actually prescribed techniques and timing specifically designed to enhance the queen's experience, making royal lovemaking a matter of state policy. Court physicians kept detailed records of the royal couple's attempts at conception, tracking the queen's cycles, prescribing specific herbs and tonics, and advising on optimal timing. These weren't casual recommendations. They were formal medical protocols designed to maximize the chances of producing a male heir. When natural methods seemed insufficient, the royal court would turn to more supernatural approaches. Special masses would be said for fertility. Relics of saints known for their patronage of pregnant women would be brought to the royal bedchamber. The queen might be given holy water to drink, or blessed oils to anoint her body. The church played a complex role in royal reproduction. On one hand, Christian doctrine emphasized the sacred nature of marriage and the importance of legitimate heirs. On the other hand, church teaching about sexuality created additional constraints. Sexual relations were officially sanctioned only for procreation, and even within marriage, certain times of year, days of the week, and hours of the day were considered inappropriate for intimacy. This created a calendar of royal reproduction that had to balance medical advice about optimal timing with religious restrictions about appropriate periods for marital relations. The king and queen couldn't simply follow their desires or even their physician's advice. They had to navigate a complex web of religious prohibitions and medical prescriptions. The queen's body became a battlefield where medical theory, religious doctrine, and political necessity collided. She was expected to be both fertile and pure, both sexually responsive enough to conceive and chaste enough to maintain her reputation. The pressure on royal women to produce male heirs while maintaining an image of virtue created psychological burdens that few modern people could imagine. Medieval chroniclers, often monks with their own moral agendas, recorded rumors and speculation about royal fertility with a mixture of scientific curiosity and moral judgment. Their accounts provide glimpses into the private anxieties of royal couples, the desperate measures they took to ensure conception, and the political consequences when those measures failed. The birth of a royal child, particularly a son, was a moment of national celebration. Church bells would ring across the kingdom, bonfires would be lit, and festivals would be declared. But the birth was also a moment of intense scrutiny. The child's legitimacy had to be verified, his health assessed, and his prospects for survival evaluated. Infant mortality was high even among royalty, making every birth both a moment of triumph and a reminder of how fragile dynastic security truly was. When the royal bedchamber failed to produce heirs, the consequences rippled through every level of society. Nobles began positioning themselves for potential succession disputes. Foreign powers evaluated their claims to the throne. The church increased its prayers for divine intervention. The absence of royal children wasn't just a personal tragedy for the king and queen. It was a constitutional crisis waiting to happen. Yet, even in this world of intense pressure and scrutiny, human nature found ways to assert itself. Kings were still men with desires, attractions, and emotional needs that didn't always align with political necessity. The rigid expectations of royal reproduction created space for relationships that existed outside the official marriage. Relationships that were both escapes from pressure and additional sources of political complexity. The medieval royal bedchamber was simultaneously the most private and most public space in the castle. It was where the king and queen sought intimacy, yet it was constantly invaded by physicians, priests, and courtiers monitoring their success. It was where the future of the kingdom was supposed to be secured, yet it was also where some of the most destabilizing forces in medieval politics were unleashed. The political marriage was a foundational institution of medieval diplomacy, but it rarely had anything to do with love. A princess was a diplomatic tool, her body a vessel for alliances between kingdoms. Her wedding wasn't a celebration of romance, but a signing ceremony for an international treaty, witnessed by nobles who understood exactly what was being negotiated. When a queen failed to produce sons, or worse, remained barren, the political implications were immediate and brutal. The marriage, that had been celebrated as a diplomatic triumph, could quickly become a constitutional disaster. Nobles who had supported the alliance might begin reconsidering their loyalties. Foreign relatives of the queen might press claims to influence. The king himself faced impossible choices between personal loyalty and political necessity. Medieval queens lived under constant medical examination. Their menstrual cycles were tracked by court physicians. Their food, their exercise, their prayers were all managed to optimize their fertility. They were given herbal treatments, special diets, and fertility rituals that blended Christian prayer with much older folk traditions. Some queens were required to drink potions made from powdered animal parts believed to transfer fertility, or to wear amulets containing fragments of saints' bones. The psychological pressure on queens was enormous. They knew that their value to the kingdom, their security in their position, and their legacy in history all depended on their ability to produce sons. Queens who bore only daughters faced increasing pressure with each birth. Those who remained childless lived with the constant threat of divorce, banishment, or worse. This pressure created strange alliances within royal courts. Queens often formed close relationships with physicians, priests, and wise women who promised solutions to their fertility problems. These relationships existed outside the normal court hierarchies, creating informal networks of power that could influence royal policy in unexpected ways. The most successful queens learned to navigate the complex politics of reproduction while maintaining their dignity and influence. They became experts in the medical theories of their time, knowledgeable about which treatments showed promise and which were merely superstition. They cultivated relationships with religious figures who could provide both spiritual comfort and practical advice. Some queens discovered that their greatest power came not from producing heirs, but from the threat of their failure to do so. A queen who understood the political consequences of her barrenness could use that knowledge as leverage in negotiations with her husband and his nobles. The threat of a succession crisis could be a powerful bargaining chip for a clever queen. The medieval medical establishment developed elaborate theories about female fertility that reflected both genuine observation and profound misunderstanding. Physicians believed that the womb could wander around the body, that women's humors were naturally colder and wetter than men's, and that emotional states could directly affect the ability to conceive. These theories shaped treatment protocols that subjected queens to everything from bloodletting to massage to complex dietary regimens. Court physicians often competed with each other to provide the most effective fertility treatments for the royal couple. Their reputations, and sometimes their lives, depended on their success in helping the queen conceive. This competition led to increasingly elaborate and sometimes dangerous treatments, as physicians tried to distinguish their methods from those of their colleagues. The failure of a royal marriage to produce heirs opened the door to one of the most politically charged processes in medieval politics: annulment. Unlike divorce, which the church prohibited, annulment was a declaration that the marriage had never been valid in the first place. This legal fiction allowed kings to end their marriages without technically violating church doctrine, but the process was complex, expensive, and politically dangerous. Grounds for annulment were strictly limited and often required creative interpretation of canon law. The most common arguments were consanguinity, claiming the couple were too closely related, or non-consummation, arguing the marriage had never been physically completed. Both arguments required evidence that was difficult to obtain and potentially embarrassing to provide. The process of obtaining an annulment revealed the complex relationship between royal power and church authority. A king might have the political influence to pressure church officials, but the church also had the power to resist royal demands if it served their interests. Annulment proceedings often became battles of wills between temporal and spiritual authority, with the fate of queens hanging in the balance. Successful annulments required careful political preparation. Kings had to ensure they had alternative marriage alliances ready, that their nobles would support the change, and that foreign powers wouldn't use the annulment as a pretext for invasion or economic pressure. The dissolution of a royal marriage was never just a personal matter. It was a major diplomatic event that could reshape the political landscape of Europe. Queens facing annulment had limited options, but the cleverest among them found ways to influence the process. Some fled to foreign courts where their relatives could provide protection. Others allied themselves with powerful nobles who opposed the annulment for their own political reasons. A few managed to turn public opinion in their favor by presenting themselves as victims of royal caprice. The medieval court provided alternative paths to influence and power that existed alongside the official marriage. The institution of the royal mistress was both an escape valve for the pressures of political marriage and a source of additional political complexity. Unlike queens, mistresses were chosen for personal attraction rather than diplomatic necessity, but their influence could be just as significant. Royal mistresses occupied a strange position in court hierarchy. They had no official status, yet their proximity to the king gave them informal power that could exceed that of many nobles. They couldn't inherit titles or pass legitimacy to their children, yet their recommendations could influence royal policy on everything from military appointments to trade agreements. The most successful mistresses understood that their power was both immense and fragile. They cultivated networks of supporters among nobles who wanted access to royal favor. They positioned themselves as confidants who could provide the king with honest advice in a world where most courtiers told him only what they thought he wanted to hear. They became power brokers who could make or break the careers of ambitious courtiers. Mistresses also served as informal ambassadors within the court, carrying messages between the king and nobles who might not have official access to him. Their quarters became alternative centers of power where deals were negotiated and alliances formed outside the formal structures of court protocol. The children of royal mistresses occupied a unique position in medieval society. They carried royal blood but lacked legitimacy, giving them significant advantages in some contexts while permanently excluding them from succession. These children often became some of the most loyal supporters of their royal fathers, understanding that their entire futures depended on maintaining his favor. Royal bastards could be powerful tools of statecraft. They could be placed in important positions where their loyalty was assured, married to foreign nobles to create informal diplomatic connections, or given ecclesiastical positions where their intelligence and education could serve the kingdom. Their existence was both a testament to royal virility and a constant reminder of the limitations of legitimate succession. The presence of royal mistresses and their children created complex family dynamics within the court. Queens had to navigate relationships with women who were simultaneously their rivals and their allies. The children of queens and mistresses were raised in the same household, creating sibling relationships that crossed the lines of legitimacy in ways that could be both touching and politically explosive. Medieval chroniclers recorded these family dramas with a mixture of fascination and moral judgment. Their accounts provide glimpses into the human emotions that existed alongside political calculation. Kings who genuinely loved their mistresses more than their wives, queens who formed protective relationships with royal bastards, children who struggled to understand their places in families divided by law and custom. The royal court was also home to more secretive relationships that challenged medieval assumptions about sexuality and power. The historical record contains scattered references to kings whose closest emotional relationships were with male companions, creating political situations that were both dangerous and difficult to document openly. These relationships existed in the shadows of medieval court life, protected by the understanding that certain topics couldn't be discussed openly without risking everything. Male favorites could gain enormous influence through their personal relationships with kings, but their power was even more precarious than that of mistresses because their very existence challenged fundamental social assumptions. The political consequences of royal relationships with male favorites could be devastating. Nobles who resented the influence of royal companions could use moral outrage as a tool for political opposition. Foreign enemies could exploit rumors about royal sexuality to undermine the king's authority. The church could condemn relationships that violated its teachings about appropriate sexual behavior. Yet, even in this dangerous environment, some medieval rulers chose to prioritize their personal desires over political safety. Their stories reveal the extraordinary human costs of medieval royal life, where even the most private emotions became matters of state policy. These relationships also demonstrate the limited ways that medieval people could express love and loyalty outside the constraints of officially sanctioned relationships. The Church's influence on royal sexuality was both profound and contradictory. Christian doctrine emphasized the sanctity of marriage and the importance of sexual restraint. Yet, the political necessities of monarchy often required kings to behave in ways that violated church teaching. This tension created ongoing conflicts between religious ideals and political reality. Medieval Christianity taught that sexual pleasure was inherently dangerous, even within marriage. Sexual relations were officially sanctioned only for procreation, and even then should be approached with solemnity and restraint. These teachings created guilt and anxiety around the very activities that were essential for royal succession. Some kings attempted to resolve this tension by embracing religious celibacy, choosing spiritual purity over dynastic duty. These decisions were politically catastrophic, creating succession crises that could destroy kingdoms. Yet they were also expressions of genuine religious conviction in a world where spiritual and temporal authority were constantly in conflict. The Church's teachings about sexuality also provided tools for political opposition. Kings whose private lives violated religious standards could face challenges to their authority from nobles who claimed to be defending moral order. Religious leaders could use their moral authority to constrain royal behavior, creating complex negotiations between spiritual and temporal power. Medieval religious culture also provided justifications for royal sexual behavior that might otherwise be condemned. The concept of divine right suggested that kings were chosen by God and therefore subject to different moral standards than ordinary people. Some religious traditions even suggested that royal blood carried special properties that required different rules for marriage and reproduction. The Church's role in royal marriages was both supportive and controlling. Religious ceremonies gave marriages their legitimacy, but church law also constrained royal choices about whom to marry, when to seek annulments, and how to conduct marital relationships. This created ongoing tensions between royal desires and religious requirements. Medieval Christianity also provided the framework for some of the most bizarre aspects of royal sexuality. Religious rituals for blessing royal beds prayers for fertility, and ceremonies for legitimizing royal children all reflected the Church's attempt to sanctify relationships that often violated its own moral teachings. Religious communities sometimes served as refuge for royal women who found themselves on the wrong side of political changes. Convents became places where divorced queens could live in dignity, where royal mistresses could retreat when their relationships ended, and where the daughters of complicated royal relationships could find respectable lives outside the constraints of court politics. The medieval understanding of dreams and portents also influenced royal reproductive life. Kings and queens often interpreted their dreams as divine messages about their fertility, the health of their unborn children, or the future of their dynasties. Court advisors included religious figures who specialized in interpreting these dreams and providing guidance based on their spiritual significance. Medieval royal sexuality was also shaped by elaborate systems of folk belief that existed alongside Christian doctrine. These beliefs included ideas about magical influences on fertility, the power of certain foods or herbs to enhance reproductive success, and the importance of timing intimate relations according to celestial influences. The intersection of Christian teaching and folk tradition created complex ritual practices around royal reproduction. Queens might attend Christian masses for fertility, while also following ancient traditions about diet, timing, and behavior believed to influence conception. These practices reveal the ways that medieval people combined different systems of belief to address problems that were both deeply personal and politically crucial. The legacy of medieval royal sexuality extends far beyond the individual stories of kings and queens. The systems of legitimacy, inheritance, and political authority that developed around royal reproduction shaped European political development for centuries. The struggles of medieval rulers to balance personal desires with political necessity created precedents that influenced how later societies understood the relationship between private life and public responsibility. The medieval period established many of the fundamental assumptions about monarchy that persisted into the modern era. The idea that royal families were inherently different from ordinary families, that their private lives were matters of public concern, and that their reproductive success was connected to national prosperity, all originated in medieval court culture. These assumptions also influenced the development of legal systems around marriage, legitimacy, and inheritance that extended far beyond royal families. The complex negotiations around royal annulments helped establish precedents for marriage law that affected all levels of society. The struggles over royal succession created legal frameworks for inheritance that shaped property law for centuries. The stories of medieval royal sexuality also reveal the extraordinary human costs of political systems that subordinated personal desires to state necessity. The queens who lived their entire lives under the pressure to produce male heirs, the kings who couldn't freely choose their partners, and the children who bore the burden of legitimacy or illegitimacy all paid personal prices for political systems that prioritized stability over individual happiness. Yet, these stories also demonstrate remarkable human resilience and creativity. Medieval royalty found ways to express love, loyalty, and desire even within systems designed to constrain their choices. They created informal networks of power and influence that provided alternatives to official hierarchies. They negotiated between competing demands in ways that preserved both their humanity and their political effectiveness. The medieval royal bedchamber was ultimately a space where some of the most fundamental tensions of human existence played out on a stage where the stakes were kingdoms and dynasties. It was where the most private human activities became matters of public policy, where personal desires confronted political necessity, and where the future of entire civilizations was quite literally conceived. As the candle burns lower and the shadows deepen around our medieval castle, were left with a profound understanding of how power, sexuality, and human nature intertwined in ways that shaped the course of history. The kings and queens who navigated these impossible pressures were neither the romantic figures of legend nor the simple tyrants of popular imagination. They were complex human beings trying to fulfill both their personal needs and their public responsibilities in a world that made few allowances for the difficulty of that balance. Their struggles remind us that even the most powerful people in history were constrained by the societies they ruled, that private desires and public duties have always been in tension, and that the choices made in the most intimate spaces can determine the fate of nations. In their bedchambers, behind the heavy curtains and locked doors, medieval royalty faced challenges that were both uniquely their own and universally human. Yet, for all this clinical precision, the medieval court was also a place where raw human emotion erupted in ways that defied all attempts at control. Kings fell desperately in love with women they couldn't marry. Queens formed passionate attachments that threatened their marriages. Courtiers engaged in affairs that could cost them their lives. The very intensity of the constraints placed on royal sexuality seemed to amplify the human desires that no amount of political calculation could completely suppress. The court became a theater where public performances of propriety existed alongside private dramas of extraordinary complexity. A king might spend his morning hearing mass, his afternoon in state council discussing military strategy, and his evening in the chambers of a mistress who provided not just physical pleasure, but emotional refuge from the impossible burdens of rule. These relationships existed in a world of shadows and whispers, protected by networks of servants, guards, and courtiers who understood that their own fortunes depended on maintaining royal secrets. The medieval court developed elaborate systems of discretion that allowed forbidden relationships to flourish while maintaining the public fiction of moral order. Royal mistresses became skilled politicians in their own right, understanding that their survival depended on more than physical attraction. They cultivated influence with key nobles, managed complex financial arrangements, and positioned themselves as confidants who could provide counsel that queens, constrained by diplomatic protocols, often couldn't offer. The children born of these relationships added additional layers of complexity to court dynamics. Royal bastards often received excellent educations and were raised alongside legitimate royal children, creating familial bonds that transcended the legal distinctions that defined their different fates. Some of these children became among the most capable and loyal servants of the crown, their ambiguous status making them valuable precisely because they could never threaten the legitimate succession. The emotional landscape of medieval royal courts was further complicated by the practice of political hostage-taking, disguised as diplomatic marriages. Young princesses were sent to foreign courts ostensibly as brides, but actually as guarantees of their father's good behavior. These women lived their entire adult lives as strangers in strange lands, their homesickness and isolation adding poignant human dimensions to the grand political strategies that had placed them there. The medieval understanding of love itself was shaped by these political constraints. Courtly love, the literary tradition that celebrated passionate but unconsummated desire, emerged partly as a response to the impossibility of freely chosen romantic relationships within the noble classes. The very artificiality of courtly love conventions reflected the artificiality of a social system that subordinated personal desire to political necessity. Medieval religious thought added another layer of complexity to royal sexuality by teaching that physical desire was inherently dangerous even within the bounds of marriage. This created profound psychological conflicts for rulers who were simultaneously expected to be models of Christian virtue and to engage in the very activities that Christian doctrine viewed with suspicion. Some kings attempted to resolve these conflicts by embracing periods of celibacy, often after military defeats or personal tragedies that they interpreted as divine punishment for their sexual sins. These religious enthusiasms could be politically destabilizing, creating succession uncertainties just when kingdoms needed stable leadership most. The Church's teachings about sexuality also provided tools for political opponents who wanted to challenge royal authority. Kings whose private lives violated Christian moral standards could face religiously motivated rebellions that combined genuine piety with opportunistic ambition. The moral authority of the Church gave additional power to nobles who might otherwise lack the resources to challenge royal power directly. Medieval medical theory, with its emphasis on the balance of humors, created additional pressures around royal sexuality. Court physicians treated royal reproductive health as a matter of national importance, prescribing elaborate regimens of diet, exercise, and medication designed to optimize the chances of conception. The king and queen's most intimate moments became subjects of medical consultation and political analysis. The failure of royal marriages to produce heirs opened the door to some of the most complex legal and political maneuvers of the medieval period. The process of obtaining an annulment required navigating between canon law, civil law, and international politics in ways that could take years to resolve and often left all parties damaged. Queens, facing the threat of annulment, developed various strategies for protecting themselves. Some fled to convents where they could live in dignified retirement while maintaining their titles. Others sought protection from powerful relatives in foreign courts. The cleverest managed to turn public sympathy to their advantage by presenting themselves as victims of royal caprice rather than failed wives. The children of annulled marriages faced particularly complex legal situations. Were they legitimate if born to parents whose marriage was later declared invalid? Could they inherit titles or property? These questions often required decades of legal wrangling and could create rival claimants to thrones generations after the original marriages had ended. Medieval courts also developed elaborate protocols around the physical aspects of royal marriage that seem bizarre to modern sensibilities. The tradition of public bedding ceremonies, where witnesses observed the beginning of royal wedding nights, reflected the understanding that royal marriages weren't private matters, but public contracts whose fulfillment needed verification. These ceremonies must have been profoundly traumatic for young brides, often teenagers who had been raised in convents or foreign courts and had little understanding of what marriage would entail. The public nature of their most intimate moments reinforced their status as political instruments rather than autonomous individuals. The morning after royal wedding nights, witnesses would return to examine bed linens for evidence of consummation and the bride's virginity. These examinations were conducted with the solemnity of legal proceedings because the validity of the marriage, and potentially the future of the kingdom, depended on their outcomes. Royal pregnancies were similarly public affairs, with court physicians, midwives, and nobles all monitoring the queen's condition for signs that might indicate the gender or health of the unborn child. Pregnant queens lived under constant observation, their diets, activities, and even emotions subject to management by advisors who believed that the queen's state of mind could influence her child's development. The birth of royal children was orchestrated like military campaigns, with protocols for every possible outcome. Witnesses had to be present to verify that the child was actually born to the queen and hadn't been substituted. The child's gender had to be announced immediately, with different procedures for sons and daughters. Even the disposal of the afterbirth was subject to ceremonial requirements designed to prevent its use in magical practices. Royal children, from the moment of birth, belonged as much to the state as to their parents. Their education, their marriages, even their friendships were matters of policy rather than personal choice. The psychological impact of growing up with this level of scrutiny and constraint must have been enormous, helping to explain why so many medieval rulers seemed emotionally unstable or made decisions that appeared irrational to modern observers. The medieval court's obsession with bloodlines and legitimacy created a society where sexual behavior was constantly scrutinized for political implications. Adultery wasn't just a personal betrayal, but a form of treason that could corrupt the royal succession. The children of adulterous relationships carried permanent stigma that affected not just their own prospects, but those of their descendants for generations. Women in medieval courts navigated this environment with remarkable skill, developing networks of influence that provided alternatives to the official power structures that excluded them. Queen mothers, royal mistresses, abbesses, and even servants created informal channels of communication and influence that allowed them to shape policy despite their legal powerlessness. The most successful women in medieval courts understood that their power depended on understanding the complex relationships between sexuality, politics, and religion that defined their world. They learned to use their knowledge of court secrets as political capital, their understanding of male desires as diplomatic tools, and their connections with other women as sources of mutual protection. Medieval chronicles provide tantalizing glimpses into these women's strategies, though the male chroniclers who recorded them often failed to understand the sophistication of female political maneuvering. Between the lines of official histories, we can detect the presence of women who wielded real influence through their mastery of the informal systems that governed medieval court life. The intersection of sexuality and spirituality in medieval courts created some of the period's most fascinating cultural innovations. The tradition of courtly love, with its elaborate codes of behavior and literary conventions, emerged partly as a way of channeling sexual desire into socially acceptable forms. The tension between physical attraction and spiritual aspiration became a source of artistic inspiration that influenced European literature for centuries. Medieval courts also developed complex gift-giving traditions that allowed the expression of romantic feelings within socially acceptable frameworks. Jewelry, books, and artistic objects became vehicles for communicating desires that couldn't be spoken directly. The exchange of tokens between lovers created a parallel economy of sentiment that existed alongside the official economy of political alliance. The physical spaces of medieval castles reflected the complex social dynamics around sexuality and power. Private chambers were designed with hidden passages that allowed for discreet meetings. Gardens and chapels provided semi-public spaces where romantic encounters could occur under the guise of religious devotion or casual conversation. Even the architecture of medieval courts was shaped by the need to manage the conflicts between public propriety and private desire. Medieval clothing and fashion also served as vehicles for sexual communication. The elaborate dress codes that governed court appearance weren't just about displaying wealth and status. They were also systems for signaling availability, conveying messages, and managing the visual aspects of attraction within the constraints of social propriety. The medieval understanding of the human body, shaped by religious doctrine and medical theory, created attitudes towards sexuality that were both more restrictive and more sophisticated than modern stereotypes suggest. Medieval people understood that sexual desire was a powerful force that could influence political decisions, spiritual development, and social stability. Their attempts to manage and channel that force created complex cultural systems that revealed deep insights into human nature. The legacy of medieval royal sexuality extends far beyond the specific stories of individual kings and queens. The legal frameworks, cultural traditions, and social institutions that developed around royal reproduction shaped European political development for centuries, and continue to influence how modern societies understand the relationship between private life and public responsibility. The elaborate protocols that medieval courts developed for managing royal marriages, legitimacy, and succession created precedents that influenced the development of family law, inheritance rights, and political authority throughout the Western world. The struggles of medieval rulers to balance personal desires with political necessity established patterns of behavior that can be recognized in the actions of political leaders throughout history. Perhaps most importantly, the medieval period's frank recognition that sexuality was a political force rather than a purely private matter offers insights that remain relevant today. The medieval understanding that personal relationships have public consequences, that individual desires can conflict with social responsibilities, and that the management of these conflicts requires sophisticated cultural institutions provides perspectives that modern societies continue to grapple with. The medieval royal bedchamber was ultimately a space where some of the most fundamental tensions of human existence played out on a stage where the stakes were kingdoms and dynasties. It was where the most private human activities became matters of public policy, where personal desires confronted political necessity, and where the future of entire civilizations was quite literally conceived and shaped by the intimate decisions of rulers who were themselves shaped by forces beyond their control. As we step back from these shadowed chambers and allow the medieval world to recede into history, we're left with a profound appreciation for the complexity of human societies that managed to create stability and continuity despite the enormous tensions between individual desires and collective needs. The kings and queens who inhabited these spaces were neither the romantic heroes of legend nor the simple villains of moral tales. They were human beings caught between competing demands, trying to fulfill both their personal needs and their public responsibilities in a world that offered few good choices and even fewer easy answers. Their struggles remind us that power has always come with costs, that privacy has always been a luxury that the powerful can rarely afford, and that the most important historical forces often operate in the spaces between what people want to do and what they believe they must do. In the medieval royal bedchamber, behind the heavy curtains and locked doors, we find not just the secrets of individual lives, but the fundamental dynamics that continue to shape how societies balance freedom and responsibility, desire and duty, in the eternal human struggle to create order without destroying the very humanity that makes order worth having. The oil lamp flickers one final time before settling into a steady glow, illuminating the last shadows of our journey through the hidden chambers of medieval power. These weren't just the private lives of distant historical figures. They were the human dramas that shaped the world we inherited, played out in spaces where love and politics, desire and duty, created the complex legacy of medieval monarchy that echoes still in our understanding of power, privacy, and the persistent tension between personal freedom and public responsibility.